How's it going? Dave here, and in today's video I'm going to be talking all about diminished chords. I'm going to talk about what diminished chords are, I'm going to show you how you can use them in your chord progressions, and towards the end I'm going to show you how you can use diminished chords to change keys. Now there will be timestamps in the description and in the comments, so if you already know what a diminished chord is, if you know what a diminished seventh chord is and a half diminished chord, then you can just skip to the parts where I talk about their application. So let's talk about a diminished chord and what a diminished chord is. The intervals of a diminished chord are a root, a flat third, and a flat fifth. And you get this kind of sound, which is quite dissonant on its own, but in the right context, it sounds really awesome. So let's take a look at some shapes for the diminished chord. We'll be playing an E diminished chord. First thing you can do is play a diminished chord here. 12 on the low E string, 13 on the A string, 14 on the D string, and 12 on the G string. Just like that. Then you can play a diminished chord like this. 7 on the A string, 8 on the D string, 9 on the G string, and 8 on the B string. Then to play an E diminished chord with the root note on the D string, we're going to be playing 2 on the D string, 3 on the G string, 5 on the B string, and 3 on the high E string. Now that is a diminished triad. We can also play diminished seventh chords. To play a diminished seventh chord, all we have to do is add a diminished seventh interval onto the top of our diminished chord. And a diminished seventh interval is enharmonically equivalent to a major sixth. So it sounds like a major sixth, but we're calling it a diminished seventh. So for example, an E diminished seventh chord would contain the notes E, G, B flat, and D flat. Now let's take a look at how you can play an E diminished seventh chord. We are going to play with the root on the low E string, 12 on the E, 13 on the A, 11 on the D, and 12 on the G. Then with the root on the A string, we are going to be playing 7 on the A, 8 on the D, 6 on the G, and 8 on the B. And then for a root on the D string, we are going to be playing 2 on the D, 3 on the G, 2 on the B, and 3 on the high E. Now, the really important thing to know about diminished seventh chords, and the really cool thing actually, is that each note is a minor third apart. So E is a minor third away from G, G is a minor third away from B flat, and B flat is a minor third away from D flat. And also, D flat is a minor third away from E, which is our root. Now, all the notes are the same distance apart, which means this chord is called a symmetrical chord. This also means that if we play our E diminished chord, we can move down a minor third, so 3 half steps. We get a C sharp diminished chord, but every single note in the C sharp diminished chord is contained within the E diminished seventh chord. And same thing if we move up a minor third, we've got the G diminished seventh chord, but all the notes in the G diminished seventh chord are the notes within the E diminished seventh chord, but just a different inversion. And the same thing for B flat or A sharp diminished seventh. Okay, so anytime you want to play maybe an E diminished chord, you don't just have to play it with the root at the E, you could play it with the root at C sharp or D or B flat, like that. Now let's take a look at half diminished chords. Half diminished chords appear diatonically in your major key as the seventh chord or the second chord in a minor key. Now a half diminished chord is also known as a minor 7 flat 5 chord, and the intervals are root, flat third, flat fifth, and a standard flat seventh. Let's take a look at how we can play a half diminished or minor 7 flat 5 chord. And the root's going to be E again, so we're going to be playing 12 on the low E string and 13 on the A string, 12 on the D and G strings, just like that. Then to play with the root on the A string, we are going to be playing 7, 8, 7, 8. So 7 on the A, 8 on the D, 7 on the G, 8 on the B string. And to play this same chord with the root on the D string, we're going to be playing 2 on the D string and then 3 on all the rest of the strings, the G, B and E strings. Okay, so those are your shapes for your diminished seventh and your half diminished chords. Now to the exciting part where we get to use them in our chord progressions. So let's talk about how we can use diminished seventh chords in our chord progressions. Diminished seventh chords can be used as passing chords in between any two chords that are a tone apart. So in the key of C, for example, we've got, first of all, chords 1 and 2, C and D. They are a tone apart, and in between we have the C sharp, and that's where you'd play your diminished chord, C sharp diminished, in between the C and the D. Let's take a listen to how that sounds. C, C sharp diminished, seventh, and then D minor. Cool, so two other chords that are a tone apart are chords 2 and 3 in our key, so D minor and E minor. So we can play a diminished seventh chord in between those, which would be D sharp. Sounds really cool. Some more places you can use the diminished seventh chord are between chord 4 and 5, so F and G in the key of C. We'd be playing an F sharp diminished chord. And also between chords 5 and 6, so in the key of C, G and A minor. So we'd be playing a G sharp diminished chord in between. And also your A and B diminished chords are a tone apart, but I don't think it sounds very nice to go from a diminished chord to another diminished chord, but you can give it a go. This is what it would sound like. Not very nice, but who knows, you might be able to use it and make it sound good. Now we can take this a little bit of a step further and play the inversions of our diminished chords. So remember I said, anytime you play a diminished chord, you can play it in those 4 places if you just move up in minor thirds. Let's see if we can do that between two chords maybe. So between C and D minor, you'd play a C sharp diminished seventh chord. But you could also play an E diminished seventh chord because it contains all the same notes of your C sharp diminished seventh chord, then head to the D. So, and it sounds really cool. Let's try this with one more example, D minor to E minor. So you'd play your D sharp diminished in between. Now that D sharp diminished we could play as a C diminished, or we could play as maybe a F sharp diminished. I think we'll use the F sharp diminished. So that sounds really nice. So give that a go. And let's talk about now how we can use half diminished chords in our chord progressions. We can use half diminished chords in a 2-5 passing into a minor chord. What that basically means is if the next chord in our chord progression is a minor chord, we can play some half diminished chords. So let's say the next chord in our chord progression is A minor. Okay, the 2 comes from what the second chord in A minor would be. So we're temporarily kind of changing key into A minor until we hit that A minor. Okay, so the 2 chord in the key of A minor, as we said before, would be half diminished chord. In this case, B half diminished. Then we'd play the 5 chord of A minor, but as a dominant 7th chord, so it'd be E7 into our A minor. So if we were playing in the key of C, for example, and we played C to A minor, we could play that 2-5 passing just before we play that A minor. So C, B half diminished, E7, A minor. Or if we were to play C to D minor, before the D minor, we could play our 2-5 passing, which would be E11, E minor 7 flat 5, A7, D minor. So just like that. So that's how you can use half diminished chords in your chord progressions. Remember, half diminished chords are not symmetrical, so you can't really do the same thing where you move them around. Right, now let's talk about how you can change keys using diminished chords. Diminished seventh chords are very, very similar to dominant seventh chords. All you have to do to change a diminished seventh chord into a dominant seventh chord is flatten one of the notes. So let's take the E diminished seventh chord. We have E, G, B flat, and D flat. Let's flatten the first note, E, and we get E flat, which means we get an E flat dominant seventh chord. Okay. Now let's flatten the G to a G flat or an F sharp, and we get an F sharp dominant seventh chord. Okay, if we were to flatten the B flat to an A, then all the notes in that chord would make an A7 chord. And if we were to drop the D flat to a C, then we'd have all the notes in a C7 chord. Okay, so that E diminished seventh chord is super, super close to an E flat 7. It's also super, super close to an F sharp 7. It's also super, super close to an A7 and a C7. Bear that in mind going forward. Now, if we play a chord progression that contains one of these dominant seventh chords, either the E flat 7, the F sharp 7, A7, or the C7, then we can basically bridge into another key using our E diminished seventh chord. So I'm going to play in the key of F. I'm going to play a 1, 6, 4, 5, which is F, D minor, B flat, and then C7. Remember, C7 is one of those chords that is super similar to our E diminished seventh chord. So from this C7, it now becomes really easy to play an E diminished chord, which we will play like this. I'm playing a C sharp diminished seventh chord, but remember, as I said, all the notes in a C sharp diminished chord are the same as an E diminished chord. So I'm technically playing an E diminished seventh chord. So we've gone from C7 to E diminished seventh. Now from E diminished seventh, we can transition to any one of those other dominant seventh chords that are close to E diminished seventh. Let's take a look at the E flat dominant seventh chord. That's the one we get by flattening our root note to E flat. So from C7, we've gone to E diminished seventh. And then from E diminished seventh, we've transitioned to E flat seventh. And that E flat seventh is the dominant chord in the key of A flat. So now we've transitioned from the key of F to the key of A flat. You could also transition to the parallel minor key, which means we could play A flat minor. It's actually G sharp minor, but it's the same root. Okay. So from E7, E flat 7 into A flat or E flat 7 into G sharp minor. So we've changed from the key of F to A flat, and this is how it would sound all together in a chord progression. It's quite a smooth transition there, and then we can just play in our A flat major key. Alright, so let's try this again with the other two options that we have. So we're going to play our F, D minor, B flat, and C7. Transition to our E diminished seventh chord. And then from there, we are going to play F sharp seventh chord, which we get by flattening the G in our E diminished seventh chord. And then that F sharp seventh chord is the dominant chord in the key of B. So that dominant seventh chord provides that tension that releases to B. And then we can play in the key of B, or the key of B minor as well. The final option that we have is to play our chord progression in F, hit that C7, move to the E diminished seventh, then move to A dominant seventh, in which the A diminished dominant seventh is the dominant chord in the key of D. So now we can play in the key of D. So let's hear how that would sound. Or D minor. So that is how you can change key with diminished seventh chords. I think it's really, really a fun thing to do. And there's a lot you can do, especially when you realize that you can play your diminished seventh chords in 4 different places. It really opens up a lot of doors for creativity. Now, if you're wanting to find some really awesome techniques when it comes to chord progressions, I have linked the first 2 chapters of my book Chord Charisma, which you can get for free down in the description. It's going to teach you a lot about adding extensions to your chords, which ones to add where. So if you want to add 7ths, 9ths, 11ths, 13ths to your chords, it's going to show you how to do precisely that. If you enjoyed the video, please click like, let me know what you thought in the comments, and subscribe to my channel, click that notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.